Ah, yes. Yes, children, come. Gather around the fire. Today, what we're gonna be doing this weekend is sit around the fire and listen to the tales of my youth. We're going to go over and rank and judge and list all of the expansions as well as the major content patches of these expansions. This came as a thought right after, the realization that after 9.0.5 we pretty much have the definitive release version of this expansion before 9.1. There shouldn't really be anything new before that major patch. So we have the completed first iteration of this expansion. So how about we just go back and we give a 2020 hindsight look at the previous versions of this game, particularly when you think that by this point this game is over 16 years old. Pretty much anyone who isn't, I don't know, 27, 28 by now basically has little to no recollection of vanilla or what he was actually doing in vanilla, even TBC, even Wrath. It's 10 years ago. If you're 20, if you're 22, even 24, you're not going to remember much of anything. And even if you did, you probably had no clue what you were doing. So take it from a boomer who remembers. Take it from someone who has played since vanilla every single major patch, how the patch releases went back in those days, how they were received, and also what were the major drama points, the major complaints of the community back in those days. Obviously, if this was a single video, it would have to be a 2-hour long video. So for now, we are going to go halfway through the game with this expansion and then finish off probably tomorrow with the rest. We are starting this list. We are starting this judgment list with, of course, vanilla. So here's the thing when it comes to vanilla. Vanilla was the first version of the game. Blizzard was basically walking in blind in the MMORPG genre. They had no idea what they were doing. And I'm saying this benevolently. It's not a critique. They had no idea. They were just trying everything and anything. They didn't even have plans for putting quests in vanilla. They just figured out in the player testing phase that people liked quests. It was a good, alternative to just grinding, which is how they were planning of making everything work when it came to experience. So sure, let's put some quests in the game. The story, there was no real storyline, there was no real campaign to follow. All of the zones were mostly detached from one another. There was no real clear narrative point as to why you were going to Molten Core and also why you were going to Blackwing Lair, but also why you were going to Zul'Gurub. It was just sort of thrown in there. It is also harder, we have to say, it is also harder to judge the patches, the major content patches, because vanilla, of course, wasn't like it is today. If I were to ask you today, even if you have played maybe a couple of expansions, maybe 3 expansions, you can kind of remember that Blizzard's MO for most of modern WoW has been 0.1, 0.2, 0.3 patches, right? 3 major content patches throughout the year, 3 extra raids being released, and similar type of planning for an expansion. But back in vanilla, as I mentioned, Blizzard was walking in blind. Blizzard had 12 major content patches in vanilla. But all of those content patches were not like you can see them today. For example, one content patch was just adding tier 0.5 armor sets. That's it. Here's your content patch. Another one was releasing Blackwing Lair and then the Darkmoon Fair. Another one was releasing Zul'Gurub, which were decently sized patches. But then there was also the one that introduced Alterac Valley and Warsong Gulch. So it's harder to just judge, all of those tinier patches in size. So we're just going to look at the 2 major ones. The 2 major ones, which were All of the Necropolis for Naxxramas and Gates of Ahn'Qiraj, of course. Gates of Ahn'Qiraj as a whole was the larger patch of all of vanilla. So we have to say that for the game itself, we're going to bow our heads and give it the respect it deserves. So we're going to put World of Warcraft vanilla, the base version, the base iteration of the game, in SSS plus tier. It's the motherlode, it's patient 0. It's what started everything. So you have to also value that highly. Now, when it comes to the patches, as of course there aren't too many, as of course they weren't that very largely sized. To make it clear, if we were to judge the size of this vanilla patches in any other expansion, they would all be going down to like the D tier, the C tier, because they were just not big enough, because there were so many. So the Gates of Ahn'Qiraj goes into the A tier. The Gates of Ahn'Qiraj was actually a pretty good patch, even for modern standards. It was the best one. For vanilla standard, definitely. It released a 40-man raid in the Temple of Ahn'Qiraj and the 20-man raid in the Ruins of Ahn'Qiraj. One thing of particular importance, and this is how makeshift things were back then. It even released the actual proper graphics of the historic tier 2 that you know today. You know the good old LARPing, human, male, crusading, retribution paladin with tier 2, crusader title, and all that sort of cliche shit? That is only possible because of this. Because the tiers, the tier 2 of back then, actually turned out to be like they are now, and not the green armor model shit you had for a long time, for several months, when Blackwing Lair was released. It also had several other quality of life changes, but the main changes were related around Ahn'Qiraj, the, I guess, revamping a little bit of Silitus, giving it a little bit more life, since before then there wasn't much in there. The event itself as well, the war effort event for Ahn'Qiraj, which you just went through, some of you, in Classic, was also a big thing. Yeah, okay, some might say, some who still remember might say, yeah, it was a very high quality slideshow to be in there at 3 FPS, and just maybe sometimes see your character move once every half an hour, but, we're just valuing the concept here. It's the thought that counts. Now, as for the Shadow of the Necropolis, the Naxxramas patch, I decided to take sort of the two opposites, because the Naxxramas patch goes into the C tier. I think it was, of lower effect, mostly because there was just Naxxramas out. There was a slight addition in Eastern Plaguelands to basically rework Light Soap Chapel to make it sort of like a quest hub for your token turn-ins, for your grinding in the zone, in the region. But beyond that, there wasn't much. And then something we have to add, basically less than 3% of the player base actually got to progress in Naxxramas. So it is a major content patch. 80% of this patch is around the raid, and only 3% of the player base actually gets to see it. So, it's not a lot. You're basically telling me that this patch for 97% of the player base was a bunch of mobs in the Eastern Plaguelands could give you reputation with a faction that you weren't going to do much with. Besides some patterns and some recipes, sure, but, it wasn't enough, it wasn't much. All in all, from when we started at the release of Vanilla, which was SSS last year, did it change at the end after we have gone through all of the content patches? Was the expansion losing in value? Was it disappointing towards the end? I would say no. I would say it's still there. It is still, the paragon, the version to aspire to for this game. And now, moving on. So, with Burning Crusade, Blizzard has lots to modernize, lots to improve, that they try to go. This is where we start seeing a little bit more planning, a little bit more experience based on what Blizzard learned from Vanilla. There are, of course, several points, like, for example, the complexity and the options and variety when it comes to specializations. Way more viable specializations compared to Vanilla. We also have a rework and also a better system for talents, although it is still the good old talent tree. Blizzard also seemingly very excited, goes all out when it comes to dungeons, because they come out with this idea of having a single zone spanning multiple dungeons. You have Hellfire Citadel, you have the Coilfang Reservoir in Zangar Marsh, Oakindon in Terrakar Forest, Tempest Keep, with multiple dungeons in there, not just one, not just two, sometimes even three. So the base release of Burning Crusade goes into the S tier. It was a very high quality release. You had a bunch new things. You had the introduction of Arena, the first release of Arena, all the way back in TBC. You have, of course, the addition of the two races, which now allowed you to have Paladins and Shamans for cross factions, no longer limited to just Shaman for Horde and Paladin for Alliance with Blood Elves and Draenei. This release is particularly in the S tier because of how busy it was. If we were to judge the first tier of the raids, remember, guys, try to remember that there is no Mythic Plus, okay? There is no other main activity outside of raiding. There is dungeons, heroic dungeons introduced in TBC, compared to just the endgame dungeons of Vanilla. But outside of the heroic dungeons, after you get past Karazhan, those dungeons become very obsolete. So you have, at the release, in the first version of the game, lots of things to do because of attunements. You have seen plenty of pseudo memes regarding the attunements of TBC and how far they spanned. Even the entrance to heroic dungeons were attuned. Basically everything was attuned, all the way up to the entrance to Mount Tigel was attuned. To the point that over time these attunements had to be nerfed because they were becoming a little bit extreme. It would have taken you months of getting Lady Vash and Kael'thas kills to get the attunement to enter Mount Tigel for an entire 25-man raid. It wasn't just, hey guys, I got the key, let's make everyone else enter. No, everyone had to be attuned. So the base release of the version also kept you very busy. This sort of makes up for the tier, because the first raid tier was disappointing. We have to point out that Magteridon was part of the first tier on release, and it was heavily overtuned. Basically, the vast majority of guilds, even top world guilds, basically gave up. Several of them even trying to progress it, because it was a waste of time. due to how overloaded it was. Then there was Ulduar and Karazhan. Karazhan, while being a soft spot for many players, whoever played TBC, many people remember it fondly. However, at its core, it was a 10-man raid in a 25-man raid expansion that showered you in loot. This was bad, not just because it sort of devalued the quality of epics compared to what you were used to in vanilla, but it was particularly bad because it gave you the wrong impression. You got showered in gear in Karazhan and you thought you could just stroll into Serpent Shrine Caverns and Tempest Keep and business as usual. Except when the casual guilds, the more laid-back players entered those raids, there were a bunch of mobs with a baseball bat and they bashed their fucking teeth in. That's what happened. It is actually a historical correct reenactment. Those two raids, SSC and TK, were massive guild cockblockers for lots and lots and for a long time in this expansion. If we have to find a critique of this expansion, was the fact that the progression, the character PvE progression, was the worst of any expansion. You had people stuck on Karazhan when Sunwell Plateau was out. You had people stuck on Karazhan and Gruul when the actual raiding guilds were progressing on Black Temple. That's how skewed it was. People just couldn't get into SSC and TK and they were just stuck. There was no catch-up gear. There was no normal mode of the raid. There was no Titan Forging. There was no Mythic Plus. So they had nowhere else to go. So the expansion stays in S tier for its release because of the many things you had to do. However, we have some problems going forward, which is the scaling, the progression path of your character for power. Something that has been talked about right now, for example, with the lack of loot and similar things. In TBC, it was actually pretty severe as we go into the first patch of the expansion. 2.1 is the Black Temple patch. It seems weird because Black Temple, many people remember it as, oh, it's like it's at the end of the expansion, you know, it's Illidan. No, Serpent Shrine Caverns and Tempest Keep were already in the game, enabled, and so technically it was montageal. It's just that montageal needed you to kill Lady Vash and Kal'Thas. So it wasn't actually progressable for several months. So this patch, this Black Temple patch, goes into the B tier. It did add, of course, at its main selling point, the raid, the Black Temple raid. It did add a new sort of end game zone, which was Skeptis, for reputation farming, you know, with the Skyguard for the mounts, as well as the Netherdrake, the Netherwing faction and questline continuing, and the Netherdrake becomes available in this patch, as well as Ogrilla. This was basically the daily patch. The dailies introduced into the game for the first time, for the first real time in like massive numbers compared to what we had before. So because there wasn't much else technically outside of the raid, it stays in B tier. What followed is actually the first disappointing one, which is patch 2.3, the Gods of Zul'Aman. The Gods of Zul'Aman goes into C tier. What happened with this patch was what I mentioned at the start. You know, the cracks in the armor started showing. Because Blizzard released Black Temple, guilds were now starting to progress on Black Temple and Mount Tigel after killing enough times SSC and TK bosses to get the attunement. They were getting into what was the third tier of the expansion, so tier 6. And people were far behind, you know. People were not seeing this content because they were fucking busy clearing the Curator for the 70th time in Karazhan. So Blizzard had to throw them a bone. The bone in question was Zul'Aman. A 10-man raid with better than Karazhan, better than Gruul's Lair level gear for them to try to close the gap to Lollipop, to Rubberband, the difference in item level and in power between characters who actually were able to keep up the progression, the raid progression, and characters who were left behind. Blizzard still made sure to leave behind, you know, a treat for actual raiders, the timed run of Zul'Aman, which allowed you to get the, you know, the red Warbear of Zul'Aman no longer obtainable. But, you know, the main big part, the main selling point of that patch was basically just Zul'Aman. So it can't really go higher than C tier when it's just a 10-man raid. Then we go into the last patch of the expansion, which was 2.4, Fury of the Sunwell. This patch goes into the A tier, higher than Black Temple and the better main content patch of this expansion. We go back to the point of modernity, similar to the Gates of Ahn'Qiraj patch, because this patch gives you a raid, it gives you a dungeon, and it gives you, for the first time, something we will see often and now we have come to expect, a zone, an endgame zone to be into. Not just a tiny zone like Skeptis or like Ogrilla, you know, a tiny little bit of land to do some dailies, an actual entire zone. Of course, the Isle of Kel'Danas isn't that big, but still, it's a place to go to when you're at the end game, to gather around, to spontaneously generate world PvP as well, of course. Following the story of the assault on the Sunwell, of course, you have the Shattered Sun offensive throwing, leading the assault, and you following up more daily quests. You know, Blizzard had to increase the daily quest cap to 25 because now we're starting to get some good number of daily quests. Blizzard is starting to like this system. This is also for historians the patch that gives us advanced combat log. Basically the patch that makes sites like Warcraft logs possible. Tracking of what happens in game through the combat log and then being able to upload it to sites that are able to read it and then repurpose it and repackage it in an easy to read version for you. This is also the start of better API tracking, so things like ranking sites start becoming more and more accurate and more precise. Back to the earlier days of TBC and for the entirety of vanilla, rankings were mostly makeshift rankings made by people having to take screenshots of their kill and then post it on the forums for those kills to be considered official. You know, that's how scuffed it was back in the day. With this patch, everything starts to become more automated and also more certain, more precise. So, it is a patch which was of higher quality. This patch also adds better badges of justice in the continued attempt of Blizzard to trying to bridge the gap of item level between high-level, high-end raiders and the rest. Badges of justice, they already were improved in item level from Karazhan version to Zul'Aman, and then they were improved even more in Sunwell Plateau. Now you had almost Mount Aigel quality item level from your badges of justice in Sunwell. So the first, you know, welfare loot was out in full force by the end of TBC because of the problems that Blizzard created at the start with the difficulty in progressing Serpent Shrine Caverns and Tempest Keep. Some people might not like it, like myself. Some people might not like welfare loot, you know, giving away loot for free, but don't confuse the issue of free loot of like Warlords or Legion or BFA with TBC, because in TBC it was actually really dire compared to now. So overall, the expansion starts out as an S tier. We go through its 3 major content patches. Did anything change? Did anything make the expansion worse as a whole? No. Burning Crusade stays as S tier, as an expansion. So now we move on to the next. So, Wrath of the Lich King. You know, I'm sort of like a romantic. I think a lot of people saw Wrath of the Lich King as like the culmination of the trilogy of WoW. It was the sort of like the end of part 1 of WoW, when the end boss was the Lich King. It was Arthas, you know. WoW was spawned of Warcraft. For many months of many expansions, starting from vanilla, many things were still a recollection from Warcraft 3. Many things that were happening, many new zones that you were seeing, you were like, oh yeah, that was like from Warcraft 3. Oh, I remember this mission, you were actually fighting these guys, you know. This is now long gone. It doesn't happen often that to this day you have something that reminds you of Warcraft 3, but back in the day, you know, the Lich King was sort of the culmination of this. Because after the Lich King and you go into Cataclysm, in Mists, Warlords, you know, it's a bunch of new stuff, new lore, new story, whereas Wrath of the Lich King sort of closes out the connections, the heavy, deep connections with Warcraft 3. In TBC, you had Illidan, you had Lady Vash, you had Kel'Thas, basically, again, plenty of callbacks to Warcraft 3, and Icecrown is going to be the same. You have Kel'Thas in Naxxramas, re-exhumed for the raid. In Wrath of the Lich King, you have Icecrown, so I do see it sort of as the culmination of the first part of this game. How does it start, though? How does the expansion start as a whole? So, the expansion starts well. It starts out, first of all, with the release of the Death Knight. We mentioned the races of TBC. This time we get a class, the hero class. You know, back in the day there was the hype around the hero class. The idea of the hero class was sort of a character that was too strong to be a random chump starting at level 1 with a blunt sword. You know, a Death Knight cannot start like that, doesn't make sense, which is why Death Knights didn't start at level 1. Similar thing, for example, to Demon Hunter. Demon Hunter is our second hero class. So we did get the first hero class back in Wrath. The amount of dungeons were many and varied, not at the same level, not at the same level of thickness as TBC, but still plenty. They also kept a similar way of spreading around the main zone. You know, Ulduar had the Halls of Stone, but also the Halls of Lightning. Azul Nerub had the Azul Nerub dungeon, but also Ahn'Qiraj. You had Atger Keep as a zone, which had the Keep and the Pinnacle dungeons. You have the Nexus, which had the Nexus, the Oculus, and the Raid, Eye of Eternity. It did keep in line with how TBC worked, which is also in line with how Vanilla worked, right? The multiple dungeons around a key zone, like, for example, Blackrock Mountain in Vanilla. Following the daily plan of TBC, this is the expansion that added a more clear, streamlined reputation grinding for factions. You know, you had the whole championing system where you could use your Tabard to enter certain instances and gain reputations. And then, of course, the usual grind where towards Revered and towards Exalted, you could get plans and schematics and, rare things for you to get with those reputation factions. This was also the patch, for the record, which gave us the barbershops and the ability to change your look as a character. It also gave you the guild calendar, however useful that might be, as well as a new profession, inscription, because of glyphs being a new addition. So the expansion overall comes out as an S tier, similar to the Burning Crusade. Unlike the Burning Crusade, you did not have, as much to do. At release, when it comes to attunements, Blizzard toned down a lot when it came to attunements for Wrath of the Lich King. In fact, not many. There was basically no attunement required for the dungeons. You only had the attunement for entering Malygos, the Hour of Eternity. The first tier, though, the first tier of Raid was higher quality than Burning Crusade. You did have, yes, this has to be mentioned, a rehash, a reusage of Naxxramas, which also kind of rubbed some people the wrong way. Because, Naxxramas had this aura, this mystical aura of this old, very hard raid that very few people got into. So this idea of making it a loot piñata in Naxxramas didn't sit right with a few people. However, it kind of kept things a little bit fresh by adding the Immortal title. So being able to clear the entire raid without a single member dying during boss encounters. So it kind of kept it a little bit fresh. Plus, you had also the addition of Sartarion's Lair and Malygos. Yes, Sartarion was kind of a meme. It was sort of undertuned to the point that you could just zerg it and be fine. So it's not really that much of a plus for your raid tier. But Malygos was a very good boss fight. It was very nice. It was a very good addition to the tier. It was in fact the hardest boss of the whole tier. So the first version of Wrath, the base release of Wrath, was actually a very high quality release. Now, as for the patches, this is where we continue the streamlined version of 0.1, 0.2, 0.3 patches that we had in TBC, but these are way more precise. In TBC, yes, we had 3 major patches, but they were all over the place. We had Serpentshrine Caverns and Tempest Keep already out at release, and then we had Mount Tygel already out at release, but actually only playable over a year later. And then we had Black Temple being released, and after Black Temple you have Zul'Aman, which is a much lower item level raid, being released months later. So yeah, the patches were the same, but they were kind of jumbled up in TBC. In Wrath, they were actually much more simple. Base release, into Ulduar, into the Colosseum, into Icecrown. Very streamlined. So the first patch, of course, is Ulduar. Secrets of Ulduar is our first content patch that goes into the S tier. So we have to say, sort of, that the Secrets of Ulduar patch is kind of cheating. Because the patch itself releases Ulduar as the raid, of course, but what few people might know or even remember, the Argent Tournament and the Argent Tournament grounds, so all of the following dailies, the minigames in there, as well as the reputation, faction, rewards, the mounts and all of that, came with Ulduar, not with the Call of the Crusade. So it kind of inflates the quality of the patch by basically stealing content that should have been for the patch following. On top of that, let's have a celebration, because this is the patch that introduces dual talent specialization. So we have to go all the way through vanilla, past TBC, to get our dual talent spec, our dual spec. So Ulduar, of course, was a very good raid, very high quality. It was probably enough by itself to put it into A tier as a patch, but then, the addition of the Argent Tournament plus the dual talent spec, it kind of makes it a very nice patch. However, if we mention the quality of the Secrets of Ulduar patch, we also have to mention the logical following, which is the Call of the Crusade. And the Call of the Crusade is our first D tier patch, one of the worst patches, because, well, number one, as I mentioned, the patch is about the Colosseum, is about the Argent Tournament, and it releases without a tournament, because the tournament had been live for months already. So that's already awkward. So what the patch actually gives you is the Trial of the Champion dungeon and the Trial of the Crusader and Grand Crusader, so normal and heroic mode. This is worth mentioning because up to this point heroic mode did not exist. Up to this point the difficulty in raids was decided by hard modes, so you only had 10-man mode and 25-man mode. If you wanted to do the hard mode, the version, the mythic difficulty that you have today, it would have meant you had to do something special, like for example going into Mimiron's room and click on the red button before fighting him. Or of course the lights in the darkness fight with Yogg-Saron, not getting the help of any of the keepers. That was the version of your mythic difficulty basically. This was the patch that basically removes that. Now you only have normal or heroic, that's it. This patch still had some few things left, like the achievements, like the tribute to insanity, basically one-shot the end boss, one-shot Ahn'Qiraj. However, this patch sort of created some drama because it also tried to introduce the Crusader's tribute, essentially an idea of putting a limited amount of attempts for bosses in the raid. Yeah, not many people liked it. The idea was the faster you are at killing the bosses with the least amount of wipes, the bigger the rewards. But still, the amount of wipes, basically putting a timer in your raid, in the amount of raids you could do, getting more, frustration and tension whenever someone fucks up and ruins one of your attempts. Yeah, people didn't really like it. And then there was the other complaint about the raid sets, the tier sets, which were considered lazy. And also fewer than in Ulduar because they were basically armor type specific. So it made people even more annoyed. So all in all, there wasn't really enough to keep people interested in this patch, particularly with the Argent tournament going to the Ulduar patch. Only the last tier of the Argent tournament grinding, after you reached Crusader title, you got some new things with the patch, but for most other people, there was not enough. So this leads us to the end patch. I pointed out at the start, this felt like the culmination of the first part of the game with Icecrown and with the Lich King. And Icecrown, of course, is the main culprit. Now, to me, Fall of the Lich King goes into the B tier as a patch. Now, let me explain. On the surface, it doesn't look too bad, because on the surface, this patch gives you 3 dungeons. Not 1, not 2, but 3. It gives you the Forge of Souls, it gives you the Pit of Sauron, and it gives you the Halls of Reflection. Sort of to almost highlight the importance of the patch. Almost the historical, or at the very least, the lore importance of the patch. You had much more story-heavy driven dungeons in Icecrown, particularly the Halls of Reflection. I consider the Halls of Reflection a very nice lore-related dungeon. You don't get many nowadays of this type of feel of dungeons. And then, of course, you have the raid. You have Icecrown Citadel. Now, the main complaint as to why it goes to B tier is because outside of this, there was nothing else. Okay, there was no new zone, no new dailies, no new activities. There was no, campaign. There is no war campaign, garrison campaign, castle campaign, nothing like that up to this point. So most of your story was taken through cinematics and the Halls of Reflection dungeon story, and some of them in Pit of Sauron and Forge of Souls. So outside of that, it was kind of empty. You have already been in Icecrown. There was no new end zone because the Icecrown had already been traversed multiple times because of the reputation farming you did there, as well as the Argent tournament. So basically, it was just the raid and the dungeons. Now, dungeons weren't really that needed anymore. We were at the end of the expansion. Many people, by this point, already had higher gear than what they could have gotten from these dungeons, unless they weren't raiding at all. The 10-man mode Trial of the Crusader was just enough to outgear anything these dungeons could have given you, so it wasn't that needed to do, and so all that's left is Icecrown. Well, if Icecrown is as good as Ulduar, and Ulduar I said was enough to go into the A tier by itself, then no problem. Yeah, there's the problem. Icecrown wasn't as good as Ulduar. Despite many people's memories, fond memories, we have to point out that most of these memories are just you running in there for transmog runs and just one-shotting everything. Back during actual progress time, it wasn't very nice. Most of the first part of the raid was undertuned. Saurfang was kind of a bitch, but outside of Saurfang, it was kind of like a walk all the way up to Putricide. You go past Putricide and then it's just the Lich King. It was sort of undertuned with a few, notable bosses to go through, but for the most part, it was sort of disappointing. Yeah, sure, the Lich King fight was great. It was nice, but I don't think it's enough. I don't think it's enough to make up for the hype that was being brought to this patch and to this dungeon and to this end boss to bring it higher than B tier. So at the end of all the patches of Wrath of the Lich King, we have put Ulduar in S, and then Fall of the Lich King in B, and then the Call of the Crusade in D. I don't think overall it sort of takes away from the quality of the game. If your base game is in the S tier, then you have a very strong base to start from. I think the base version and Ulduar carried most of the expansion to a good result by the end. Icecrown was still fine. I didn't say it was bad. It was still a good patch. It was just the hiccup in the middle, really. The Call of the Crusade was sort of I could say, failed experiment, sort of.
No peace when the world itself is devoured by rage.
So, after Wrath, we have the last part of this video, which is Cataclysm. Cataclysm follows the same pattern 4.1, 4.2, 4.3 that we have had previously. Now, the release of the expansion was a little bit lower than previous, so you have a combo breaker. Cataclysm release goes to the A tier. it was still solid at release. You still had the addition, for example, of reforging, more, I guess, relevant Justice Point gear for players. You had the talent tree update compared to Wrath. You had the attempt at the triage healing system for heroic dungeons. Plenty of people crying for the way heroic dungeons worked in Cataclysm. Up to the start of the expansion, it looked like it would have continued to be high quality. People had high hopes coming off of Rise of the Lich King. The subscribers just kept rising at the release of Cataclysm, so people were just going on as usual. Now, the first problems of this expansion, despite the good release of it, were in the first patch, in Rise of the Zandalari, because the first content patch, which comes out a few months after the release, did not actually have a raid. This is the first time a major content patch, 4.1, doesn't give you a raid. Instead, Blizzard brings out Zul'Aman and Zul'Gurub, re-exhumed from the past as 5-player heroics. Now, the patch basically had nothing else. It basically just had these two. Didn't even have any major balance tuning. It was minor as well. So it kind of left people with sour taste in their mouth, because they were expecting a raid and they got trolls. That was also part of a series of memes which would have continued for quite a few years about Blizzard, reusing troll stuff throughout the expansions. So this first patch, this Rise of the Zandalari, goes into the D tier. Because, the lack of the raid and only 2 dungeons being released, which could have been good if they were properly nice dungeons, as we will see with something like Return to Karazhan, except these dungeons were just reused from the past. There was basically barely anything added that was new for this patch. So the first actual major content patch was 4.2, Rage of the Firelands. This is the patch that gives you a more modern release with the raid and an entire new system, an entire new zone with the Firelands invasion storyline. You have the regrowth, so the part that is being healed in Mount Tigel, all green and shit, and then you have the actual Firelands, when you try to basically siege the home world of the actual boss of the raid, the end boss of the raid, Ragnaros. There is the new reputation, there is the new dailies, etc, etc. So this patch stays in the B tier. The reason why it stays in the B tier is because the zone was okay, the dailies were still okay, the raid was a little bit disappointing. So Firelands at release had a few problems, mainly detuning, specifically related to Ragnaros. Now, I haven't really kept track, I haven't really counted, but I'm gonna go on good faith and say that Heroic Ragnaros was pretty much the biggest guild killer we have seen so far, and the biggest guild killer we would see for years. It was a brutal fight, very, very nasty, particularly bad also because it was in the middle of the expansion, so just to kill any hopes you had, any drive you had to keep playing the game with this boss. You did have the comeback of a legendary. In Wrath you had the mace, the spell power mace in Ulduar, and then you had, of course, Ice Crown with Shadowmourne. So now we have a comeback with the legendary, with Dragon Wrath, the staff, but I mean, it's not enough. It's not that the patch gains more value just because there is a small quest chain for a staff legendary. I don't think the new zone with the new dailies plus the raid, which wasn't, a knockout quality raid, is enough to go higher than B tier. So the expansion has to be saved after the sour note, after sour note, after sour note of the previous patches, has to be saved by 4.3, the Hour of Twilight with Dragon Soul. So this patch is very similar to Ice Crown, because it releases 3 dungeons, End Time, Well of Eternity, and Hour of Twilight. Very similarly to Ice Crown, it also has quite a few story-deep dungeons in here. Plus, of course, the raid, Dragon Soul. Not much anything else new as a whole. Yes, we have to mention the RF words are being introduced. The Raid Finder is going to be out in Cataclysm at the last raid tier. That's when it comes out, together with Transmogrification. You get a new legendary, you get the Fangs of the Father, daggers for rogues. So let's just go immediately to the main issue here, the core of the issue. The patch as a whole, Hour of Twilight, goes into the C tier, mostly centered around the raid. Overall, Cataclysm had the more disappointing raid tiers of any expansion. I don't know how much you want to value and weigh vanilla, but so far, definitely the more disappointing. Dragon Soul was, again, pretty bad as a raid, even worse than Firelands because it was even longer. And again, the end boss is what gives you a bigger sour taste in your mouth. Blizzard was aiming to do things big. After all, Deathwing is fucking huge. So they split the end boss in 2. They make you fight the spine of Deathwing before reaching the madness of Deathwing. That was not liked by many people. The fight itself, particularly spine, was a nightmare. Not fun at all. And then you have one of the problems which would have started being an actual issue at the end of the expansion, which was the duration of the tier. Because it started with Ice Crown, Blizzard had to release, in that patch, the Ruby Sanctum, which is basically a free loot piñata boss just to keep people interested. But with Dragon Soul we didn't even have that. This tier lasted basically a year. So you started entering the issue, the problem that the last tier is lasting forever. And you don't have Mythic Plus, guys. There's nothing repeatable for you to do. It's just a raid and it's lasting forever. So it is progressively making people more disappointed the longer the raid tier goes on. Which is possibly why so many people have sort of like a bad taste, a bad memory of Dragon Soul as a raid, because it lasted so long. Maybe if it was in the middle of the tier, maybe if it only lasted 6 months, people would have seen it more positively, but as a matter of fact, they didn't. So for the same point we have made about the others, Vanilla, Burning Crusade, and Wrath, they were released in a certain tier after all of the patches. Did they go any worse? No. What about Cataclysm? Well, yeah, I think Cataclysm was released into the A tier at the end. After seeing all the patches, is it still into the A tier? No. I think it goes down to the C tier. I think it was the more disappointing expansion, given the premise, given the quality it had at release, the possibility, the hopes you had at release. I think it was pretty disappointing in the end. So with Cataclysm, we close the first part of our trip down memory lane. Even after more than half an hour, we are still back 8 years ago. So there's still a long way to go, but we have gotten through 4 versions of this game. We can see that the first 3 versions of the game were actually high quality and stayed that way for most of their life, although some bumps here and there in their patches, particularly Call of the Crusade and Rise of the Zandalari, were really disappointing. You had Ulduar, which was sort of the shining point in the entirety of Wrath. I would say Fear of the Sunwell was for TBC as well. And then you have Cataclysm. We get into the 4th version of the game, the 3rd expansion, and we start seeing some problems. So, in the next video, we're gonna start with Mists of Pandaria. Definitely, the more contested, the more argued about version of the game in terms of quality, in terms of rating. I've seen people give it a 4 out of 10. I've seen people give it a 9 out of 10. So that's gonna be fun. So for now, I'm gonna stop here, halfway through the lifespan of this game. Tell me, which ones do you think were actually much better for you if you have played them, if you have a better memory of those patches or those expansions as a whole for you, while we wait together for the second part of this video. For now, I'll leave you, I'll abandon you to your thoughts, and in the meantime, I wonder how low Worlds of Draenor is going to be.